what's up, YouTubers? This is Gil, and I'm the one with the 80s videos, the one with the uploads of all the 80s stuff and 90s, and I still have a lot more to go. And I tell you, it's been my life for a long time. I've been doing this for a very long time, videoing and video documentary of life. Well, that's how it's just me anyway. Well, anyway, the purpose of this video is that I'm gonna talk about how I compare the 80s life, or how I compare how things were in the 80s with today, with how it is today, like how I would compare the two, like, and everything. So first thing I'm going to talk about like the technology aspects of the 80s and today, as of today, 2017, as of this video anyway. So the electronics and entertainment in the 80s, the prices were big. They were TVs and VCRs and video cameras, car phones. They had phones at the time for cell phones, but they were more like car phones. Things like that were very expensive back then. Only rich people were able to have them. But whether rich or not, electronics were more simpler then. Each item you had did it just one thing. A radio cassette player is gonna just play music. A phone on the wall, you know, like those rotary phones, it's just gonna be used for phone calls only. And the TV that you have in that living room, it's just for TV shows. Or camera, like a snapshot camera, or even a video camera if some people are able to afford those. All they do is take pictures and videos, that's all they do. But a typical time back in the 80s, some people had VCRs, but not everybody though. Renting VHS movies, but you gotta make sure that you have to rewind them, or else they charge 50 cents. A typical family owned a 19-inch TV, like color TV, but not all of them had remote controls though. Watching regular TV most of the time, or you know, sitcoms or news or whatever, or you could sometimes play the Atari and Nintendo. But for the Atari, you gotta switch the switch box on the back of the TV. Sometimes you may gotta clean up the contacts, and you're good to go. Usually it doesn't give a hassle, rarely gave hassle. And then remember the times when we used to record music off the radio on our cassettes and maybe make records, buy records and stuff. But we needed a lot of time. Remember that? You had to go through all the music. You had to go through the entire tape, or you had to go through the entire song. You know, you have to listen to the entire song to record. It's not like today's MP3s where you just download it and it's done within a minute or less than a few seconds. But you had to wait through the whole song, you know. Or we used to record custom cassettes for that boom box and stuff. But you gotta remember, you know, like that you had to wait an entire 60 or 90 minutes to finish that tape, you know. Remember those days? Today, MP3s, when you download music and when you fill up that iPod, it usually takes, what, 10 minutes or 5 minutes, not even that probably. And very few people back then, back in the day, very, very few had a computer. They did have computers, but they are very expensive. But they're not anything as sophisticated as today's. And of course, speaking of which, video cameras, very, very few had them, because a video camera was like a TV camera back then. Today, like you have your video camera on your phone. Now, talking about today's electronics compared to the 80s, how I compare the 80s with today, electronics are practically free now to how much they were to the 80s. Electronics are far more sophisticated. Many of today's small electronics can do more than several things rather than what they were intended for in the first place. Our phones is no phone. It's a camera, a video camera, calendar, a movie player, video game, what have you. All in one. Oh, I forgot the phone. You see that point? In the case of simple things like a video camera, back in the 80s, which would have cost like a couple $1,000 or $1,000, today even young kids can own one of those like nothing. You know, like at the store you buy these kids tablets and they already have a video camera, and those video cameras and those tablets are gonna already be 5 times better than the best VHS camcorder that they had back in the day, I tell you. So imagine this, the cheapest phone you could buy at Walmart for maybe 40 bucks, like an AT&T Go phone, like those prepaid phones. The video camera, for instance, on that phone is going to be far better than the best super VHS camcorder there was in the 80s, which cost as much as a couple grand, and that's like translates to about $4,000 in today's money, you know, 2017 anyway. Not only that, the phone is going to have a built-in snapshot camera, and it's going to have a built-in game system, a web browser, the works. You can give it away. You could give something like that you buy for 40 bucks to any kid, even a little 6-year-old or 7-year-old, for a present. All of that for just 40 bucks. And not to mention all the games and stuff are way more, the games that the phone come with, they're way more sophisticated in than the best video games in the 80s, you know, that you hooked up on your TV. Now the convenience of today's technology, 80s, back then we mailed bills. We had to be home. Remember, we had to be home to make that phone call. Go to the store. We had to go to the store to buy our record or cassette albums, and we needed to buy blank cassettes, right? So we could record our music on cassettes and maybe bring it on the Walkman. As basically the only thing of real convenience that we had at home was phones, or was the home phones basically. But everything was quite simplified. It's not complicated like today's times are, you know, like how to use electronics of today. Each item did one simple thing. The radio cassette played music, TVs showed just TV shows, and what have you. Today, now in today's time, how I compare with the 80s, how I compare with it to the internet is like the big thing of today. Do everything online instantly. Pay bills, banking, submitting documents for the loans of buying the house or whatever. Call someone anywhere you are in your car. You have your phone with you in your car. You can call anywhere. It's not like in the 80s where we had to be home next to that landline and only in that room. You know, we can only be in that room in the 80s, but now today we got cell phones. We can go anywhere now. I mean, convenience, total convenience. Now, and then also, like, you know, you could buy today, back in the 80s, you had to go to the record store to buy your albums, but now today you could go buy music right at home, even on your phone. Find anything you need on eBay. Like, you could, rather than driving around, you could do everything in the convenience of where you're at, you know, at home. You don't even have to go anywhere to buy these records or anything. You just instantly download the pictures or share pictures and videos to your friends, and you can do that instantly on Facebook rather than sending letters. Remember the way we were able to do that with the 80s? The only way you were able to do anything like that was to send letters or talking long distance on the phone. Not to mention the greatest thing that's happened to me, the technology of today, of being able to store up all of my entire collection of pictures, music, and videos all in one tiny hard drive. Not like in the 80s Not like in the 80s where everything was all in physical formats. Like we had to have our collection, big boxes of cassettes, and we had to bring those whenever we wanted to share something with us, or whenever we wanted to share something, you know, we had to bring our bulky radios or bulky TVs, or if that we wouldn't even bother with TVs. We'd just bring the videotapes and hope that someone has that TV or VCR, you know. But anyway, and then, you know, speaking of today's technology, cars, they're more reliable, they're more better off today thanks to all the computerized parts that does everything, you know, which make it convenient to maintain the car, because we don't have to do those certain things on today's cars like we had to before, like spark plug wires, distributor caps, or timing, especially things like timing and idle adjustment or things like that. We don't have to bother with that because it's all computerized today. And then, you know, all these little adjustments, we don't have to do that because it's all computerized. And that's what's nice about today's technology versus the 80s. And then, you not to mention, the OBD technology on today's cars can be a lifesaver, you know, because, you know, it's great help on pinpointing problems on cars. In the 80s, we had to rely entirely on our expertise. We had to know everything about a car. We had to know every little thing about the car, and it takes an ultra skilled mechanic to know every part. But the OBD system makes things really convenient because it's going to tell you the code, and it's going to tell you where to start looking for the problem. And then, you know, that's what's nice about today's technology, or that's what's nice about today versus the 80s. It's just more easier today, in today's time. But the bad part about the technology and electronics of today versus the 80s, the bad part of today, you know, despite of the convenience and sophistication, it does come complication and annoyances, you know. With the changing technology, we have to keep getting updated and adapted to it, which can be kind of hard at times, you know. And today's tech is becoming more complicated to use, and it can be annoying. It gets pretty annoying when we don't know what we're doing, you know, because it's so many things to do on it, you know. I mean, so many things that we have to know, like new things that we gotta know, you know. So sometimes we may want to do a simple thing, but the technology may tend to give us a hard time because we need to figure out how they did it and all the new ways of doing things. We have to constantly, and that gets annoying with today's technology, you know. Like, for an example, you know, like in the 80s, for an example, like the Atari, we just get on the Atari, pop in the game, and we just play. That's it. That's all we do. That's all we do. But in today's video game systems like the Xbox or PlayStation 4 or whatever, I mean, it seems like every time we turn it on, we need some kind of update, you know, and then we gotta wait. We're required to do that, and we have to wait for all this junk to be ready, and sometimes the internet doesn't work, and it gives us hassle sometimes, or the disk might need to be cleaned, whatever. And well, you know, a lot of times, like internet, you know, today's technology, you know, it's gonna do that. It gives us a little bit more complicated and more hassle than the 80s, you know. So and then another scary aspect of today's technology versus the 80s is the fragileness of it. You know, those electronics, today's electronics tend to break really easily, and it would be really scary to break that hard drive, to accidentally break that hard drive with all your pictures and music on it, because, you know, you're gonna lose it all. But it's not like the 80s. It's not like the 80s where all your music cassettes were on physical content or physical formats, like when the break dance cassette you made or something, it's all on a physical cassette rather than on a hard drive, you know. And if anything would happen to the hard drive or even your phone or whatever, you lose it. It's not like a cassette. You could drop the cassette and it's not gonna break and anything, and nothing like that will happen from that example. That's today's technology versus the 80s. So it's like it's something that you got to be more careful of. It's something to be more careful of. That could be a bad thing about today's technology. But the other thing to hate is how they're making electronics. They're less considerate these days, you know. Those stupid screens of today's phones, they break too damn easily, you know. It's like they did that on purpose so we can keep paying repair shops to fix it, you know. I mean, what the hell? In the 80s, everything was bulletproof. Remember you couldn't even break anything in the 80s? Like, in the video games, those stupid disc-based games of today, I mean, what's up with that? We get tired of fixing lasers and scratched disc and jammed disc doors. We get tired of that, you know? What's up with that, you know? In today's game, like, you could, with the Atari or the Nintendo, you could play hopscotch with, you can play how we call it, like hockey with the cartridges, and it's not gonna break. But with the disc of today's games, you just barely scratch it and you can't even use it. You can't even use it anymore. You know, that's the case with the Wii anyway, for me anyway. Well, anyway, I mean, it's like the phones, you know. The phones are the big offenders, and tablets, you know, they're big offenders, you know, because you barely drop it and it's broke. And on $200-300 to fix that. What's up with that, man? What is up with that? So now, if I was gonna have my say where I would rather be, where would I rather be? My conclusion is that where would I rather stick with? I would rather stick with today, honestly, despite of the bad parts of today's technology. Evidently, the good parts do outweigh the bad part, as long as I'm willing to accept and adapt to it. Because, you know, the nice things like 1080p TVs and 1080p cameras are practically free now compared to how much they were in the 80s, you know, because and I really appreciate being able to buy a 1080p camera, video camera, with literally just a few hours worth of work, you know, literally. Not like in the 80s where I had to save 7 months to buy a simple VHS camcorder, which is not even close to as good of quality of today's camcorder that I would only need to work a few hours for compared to back then. And I love the idea of being able to, the convenience of being able to download music right at home rather than hopping stores to find that record. And ultimately being able to bring my entire video collection and videotapes and my music all in one little hard drive, which that's so nice. That's nice of today, and that's some of the basic reasons. Those are like the big things that I like about today's technology, you know. This is part 2 of my documentary of how I compare today with the 80s. Now, for how I compare the 80s with today for people and communities aspect of life. People in the 80s seemed a little more mellow and more humble in the 80s than today. It's less crowded, that's for sure. Well, in my town anyway. This is in my town in California, Southern California. Likely why people are more mellow, because it's less crowded. It was less crowded and less traffic back then. And I also feel like there's less profiling of certain products, or less hype of today of the technology, or certain brands of products or whatever. For an example, back in the days, in the 80s, I can remember that you can have any car, and people didn't care. I mean, people were not going to talk shit about what car you had, you know. But now today, people have the tendency to make you look low because of that certain brand of car or certain brand of electronic or whatever. You know, people tend to do that today. But back then, you know, you looked cool with anything. People were more nicer about that. I mean, they're not gonna be bitching about that. You know, bitching about like making you look low. That's back then. It seems that way anyway. And people. don't seem to be as friendly these days today compared to back in the 80s, in my area anyway, California. Probably because of the crowd it's become here. It's so many people, so many more people living here now than it was in the 80s. I mean, it's more crowded now. I mean, everybody's here, and that's what's contributing to people's like unfriendliness, because we're bumping into each other, and it's busy everywhere we go, and traffic all the time. I mean, it's really bad, you know, and I hate it. I don't want to even be in the LA area at all hours of the day because of the traffic. I live 60 miles away from LA. I was an Uber driver before, and I don't want to even be in LA at any hour of the day, because almost every time it takes me 4 hours to get home from LA. And LA, like when I'm over in LA, at almost all hours of the day, all hours of the week. I mean, it was not like that before. It wasn't anything like that before. But now it got really bad. I mean, it's got to the point where I don't want to even be on the freeway anymore, you know, I tell you. So, I mean, but back in the 80s, though, the traffic was more bearable, you know. I mean, it was not crowded like the way it is now, you know. But, and then, you know, and then besides that, today, I mean, I just don't feel as safe anymore these days, being outside, walking on the sidewalks like I did back then. It seems like we have more bad drivers, more hit and runs, and more drive-by shootings, or people just being upset at each other or hating each other. We got more people like that these days, you know. It just feels that way anyway. I don't feel it's safe anymore with letting my kids play outside by themselves, or even having stayovers at friends' houses anymore these days, you know. Because all the horror stories I keep hearing about, and it seems like it's more and more of them, you know. More of that happening today than in the 80s, but I'm not really sure. I could not say. But anyway, you know, back in the 80s, before I used to be able to just walk in the school grounds while it was closed. And we were able to use their playground or basketball courts. We used to typically do that back in the day. We commonly did that, and sometimes I used to even go in there just to walk around the track, you know, like to walk a mile or walk a block, or I mean walk a lap or something. But now, today, they're gated up. You can't even get in them now. I mean, when the schools are closed, you can't go in there. They're not even allowed to go in there anymore today. And I guess it's because of too many cases of vandalism, you know, I guess. Probably because of that, you know. But realistically, you know, besides that, in reality, it's also because of all the cool stuff that we have today now at home, which includes the internet. I mean, I tell you, the whole world is plagued with internet. We have the tendency to get so hooked to it now these days. Just face it. It's straight out convenient and entertaining, you know, to use right at home, in the comfort of that couch and the bed. Imagine that, you know, it's just total convenience there, you know, like entertainment and convenience. We can do pretty much anything, almost everything in bed, almost. In your bed, in your couch. Back in the 80s, the TV was the only basic thing most of us had available for entertainment. And of course, some video games, you know, everything was simple then, you know. But since we did not have all these cool gadgets today, since we didn't have those cool gadgets in the 80s, like we do today, we resort to other activities that's available. So in this case, it would be playing outside, you know. Playing outside, it was kind of like the only thing available. So we used to just go outside. We went outside more often since we didn't have these cool gadgets, you know. Often we friends got together to go do outside activities. And like, you know, for me, you know, I used to like to ride my bike on the streets in those days of the 80s. But now today, bike riding is more dangerous, that's for sure. because drivers are not careful like they used to be. You know, they're not. You know, they're not. Or maybe because it's just crowded and people, so many impatient people out there. So many out there. You know, you got a lot more impatient people out here today than back in the day. So, you know, I always feel like I'm in a rush. You know, it was definitely not that bad back then. You know. So all in all, what I have to say about this aspect, I mean, I would rather be in the 80s for this part, because people were more fun in the 80s than they are today. And they were a little more friendly, and they were more relaxed. People were more relaxed back then. After all, it was less crowded back then, you know, in my area. This is talking about my area in California. So, you know, there you have it. I would rather be in the 80s on that part. And then, you know, the weather back then, it seems like we had a lot more rain back then. We had more rain back then than we do today. And that's about it for the weather, you know. This is now part 3 of my documentary. Now we're going to talk about how I compare the 80s with today for the cost of living aspects of life. In the 80s, housing was a lot cheaper back then. Cars were cheaper to buy. You know, back in the day, you were able to buy a brand new car for like $8,000 or even $6,000. You know, it was a 1986 Hyundai XL or something that you're able to buy for $6,000, brand new. Back in the day, you know, or you're able to buy a Toyota or Nissan for $8,000, although they were stripped down. You know, they didn't have air conditioning or power windows or nothing like that. But still, you're able to buy a brand new car for $8,000 back in the day. And you know, I tell you, the gasoline. Remember, the gasoline was only $1 a gallon and even less. Remember that? But you gotta remember the one thing about all this. Never mind about all this. You gotta remember that the wages sucked back then, though. You gotta remember it sucked. The minimum wage back in the 80s, you know, although prices of houses were a lot cheaper, cars were cheaper, and gas was $1, but the wages sucked. You know, the minimum wage was $3.35 and $4.25 back in my day, and the good jobs, or the very physical ones, paid about maybe $8 an hour. But not only that, about all this, the items of entertainment, like, you know, VCRs and TVs and games or video camera, in my case, they are super expensive back then. And you gotta remember, a 19-inch TV, a regular 19-inch TV was $300 typically, but that translates to like $600 in today's money, or even $700 in today's money, for just a little 19-inch TV. And a video camera like what I had back in the 80s, 88, a typical camera, a typical nice one would be $1,000 back then, but it translates to like $2,200 in today's money. You know, it's like, imagine saving $2,200 to buy a video camera, just a video camera. And then, but you gotta remember that the wages were $3.35 and $4.25 back then. In today's wages, you could buy, I mean, in today's cameras, you could buy a really nice one for $200, and the wages is $10.50 an hour today. I tell you, so, and back then also, credit was harder to obtain than it is of today. So there you have it. Housing was a lot cheaper, and cars were cheaper to buy. But not a lot of people were able to get them, though, because it was a lot more challenging back then to get the credit for it. And not only that, the interest rates, too, on the other hand, of home loans or car loans are a lot more expensive than back then they are today. And then, but now, if we're talking about today's cost of living, for today, housing is very, very expensive. Right now, very expensive. I mean, I feel sucked about that, you know. Housing is just too expensive. For instance, you know, like a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house in San Bernardino is gonna cost no less than $200,000. Back in the 80s, you were able to buy them for like maybe $50,000. But anyway, in the 80s, for cars, cars cost more money today to buy than it does in the 80s. Even used ones too. In the 80s, back in the 80s, excuse me, back in the 80s, you were able to buy a pretty decent car, like a 10-year-old car, pretty decent mileage and condition and air, not bad, and everything for $1,000. You're able to buy a car, a pretty decent car that'll give you a good miles and everything for $1,000 back then, or even in the $800 range back in the day. We were able to buy cars, something pretty decent in the $1,000 range. But now today, if you want that same 10-year-old car with the same condition like as the 80s car, it's gonna typically be like $3,000. It's typically not less than $3,000. I mean, it's got more expensive these days to buy a car. And then you gotta remember, the gasoline today is very expensive compared to the 80s. $3 a gallon. Well, in my town it's like $2.75, $2.60 or something, but it's typically $3 a gallon. It's just these though, however, that cost more now than it did in the 80s. It's just those basic things: housing, cars, and gasoline, basically. Well, and then, you know, maybe there's other things, but those are the basic necessity things that we need today that cost more. But, you know, those are more expensive today, but however, the wages are better off, much better off. The minimum wage now is $10.50 an hour, a lot more than it was in my day. Shit, I wish I would have made $10.50 an hour back in my day. Shit, I tell you. But $3.25 or $3.50 or $3.35 is what I was making to save up for that $1,000 camcorder. But now today, with the significant change of the wages, you know, even though some of the things are more expensive, the wage increase does make up for it, especially for the gas and the car and prices of cars and bus passes or whatever, you know. It does make up for it, you know. Because, you know, the reason why is because most everything else besides houses and cars are about the same, you know, about the same price, like milk, cereal, bread, and other things of necessity, and that includes clothing and shoes, because clothing and shoes are about the same price as today as they were back in the day, as far as I know, that I know of. So all I know, I mean, all I could say about this aspect, the cost of living is higher for housing today, like how I compare today and the 80s for cost of living. Housing is higher, but fewer people were able to, I mean, the cost of living was higher in housing today, and very few people can afford housing, even with the increase of wages, you know. Think about it. More people living in the area than before. So therefore, supply and demand. But everything else, though, however, is the same. It's about the same, you know, since the minimum wage increase makes up for it. So there you have it, you know, like the cost of living is about the same overall, I would say. Because, you know, the cars are more expensive, but the higher wages help pay for the more expensive prices. And then the food is about the same price. But it's just that the numbers are twisted, like I say, you know, like because the housing is higher, the cars are higher, and the gasoline, bus passes are more expensive, but the minimum wage increase makes up for it. So, I mean, it's not so bad after all. But then also, comparing the 80s with today's as far as the economy and the cost of living, the money, how I compare the 80s with today, simple electronics were far more expensive in the 80s. Today, the electronics like TVs, and considering the minimum wage increase and all that stuff, and the inflation and stuff, they cost pennies now. TVs and electronics like video cameras or the other simple electronics, they cost pennies compared to the 80s, and not only that, the electronics are far better off, far more sophisticated. Example, back in the 80s, a simple VHS, big, bulky, heavy camcorder cost $1,000 and $3 and $35 an hour wages, versus a typical pocket-sized memory card camcorder, 1080 HD camera of today. You could buy those for $150, $200 at Walmart or Best Buy for $200, and for $10 an hour at the $10.50 hour wages. So literally, you could buy today's cameras literally working just a few hours almost. So there you have it. This contributes as well to the cost of living not feeling a change because of the cheaper priced electronics. So all in all, the conclusion of this aspect, so where would I rather be in this aspect, today or yesterday, or 80s? Well, I could say this much. Housing was cheap, but it was more difficult to get credit back then. There was too much of a challenge to get it, and the wages sucked. So for this case, I'd just rather stick with today's. I would rather just stick with today than 80s. Think this, wages are much better, and interest rates are lower than ever for cars and houses, even though they got more expensive to buy. But remember, higher wages and lower interest makes up for it, I'd rather just stay with today on this part of the 80s, basically because of the appreciation of being able to buy some really cool electronics that I would have only dreamed to have back in the 80s, needing literally just a few hours of work to buy back in the day, I tell you. Now for the final part of my comparison of the 80s with today. Now back in the 80s, now here's the laws, like how the laws are, and it's the money aspect of the laws. Today's laws, they're a lot more tougher today in the 80s, in California anyway. That's talking about California. They're a lot more tougher now than they were in the 80s. For an example, the smog laws, like the cars, the smog cars in California anyway, they're incredibly tough right now. Back in the 80s, you were able to just pay, you only needed to pay $50 in repairs if your car didn't pass. Then they waive you. That's all you were required back then. But now today, you have to pay whatever it takes to fix the car. There's no escaping it. Although they do offer assistance, for low income or whatever. But either way, you have to pay what it takes to fix it. Hopefully, your car is not a case where you need some major work and stuff. But a lot of times, though, the laws are really tough with the smog. So for that example. Now, when we're talking about traffic fines and tickets, today, the tickets and court fees and fines are very, very, very costly today, and they're very tough, and they're much more of an ass about money. It's like they like money. They like money more than ever. They're more of an ass about money today than they were back in the 80s. Because before, back in the 80s, a red light used to be about $100. Remember that? $100, and speeding tickets were maybe $25 for 10 miles an hour over, $50 for 15 miles, and $75 for 20 miles an hour over the speed limit. I've had them. Remember, I was a kid in the 80s on my scooter. I had a red light ticket, and it was 101 at the time, back in the day. And then other examples is like $50 for a lot of various other violations, like illegal U-turns or illegal left turn, whatever, and bike lane and or a motor vehicle in a bike lane. I had a ticket like that once, $50. That was back then. But now today, today, a red light ticket today, what does it cost now in California anyway? It's like 500 now, 400. The last time I heard it was like 400 bucks. The last time I heard, and then they got these cameras, red light cameras. It's really, they're really much of an ass. Although, I mean, these red light cameras, don't get me wrong, they could be nice to be able to catch someone who caused that massive accident. But sometimes a lot of us may feel that it's for revenue. But I think I heard it once that people complained about that, and then they stopped doing that in some places. But I think it's because of the expense. How could that be expensive when they have, you know, the money every time they stop somebody with the red light camera? Well, anyway, well, $500 right there for a red light typically. I mean, after court fees and all this shit, you know. And then other, and today, the other miscellaneous violations like illegal U-turns, the same thing as the 80s, they're now like $200 or $300 each. I mean, typically $200 or $300 now each. So, I mean, like, the courts do seem to be more of an ass about money now these days than back in the 80s. Also, traffic school, you know, the example of how they're an ass now compared to the 80s. Traffic school, you know. Back in the 80s, the courts back in the 80s, they allowed us to go to traffic school once a year, every 12 months, and they used to waive us from paying the ticket. In other words, we didn't have to pay the ticket back then if we qualified for traffic school. Back then, we just had to pay 25 bucks to go to traffic school, and then 25 more dollars for the school itself. So, and then we didn't have to pay the ticket. We were waived back in the day. And then, but now, today, they require you to pay the exorbitant price of tickets before you can even go to traffic school, on top of the, now I think it's $50 now, or $75, I don't know. I don't know what it is right now. To be able to qualify for traffic school. But all this is so that way you could remove a point in your driving record. Anyway, not today. You have to pay the whole ticket before you can go to traffic school, and it's never going to be less than a couple $100. Never less. On top of the $50, and then the school itself is probably what, like 50 bucks now, 60, 70. I'm not really sure. I hadn't had to go to traffic school in a long time. And everything. And not only that, they allow you to go to traffic school every 18 months instead of 12. So, I mean, you don't get a chance. You don't get a chance to go to traffic school as often now to remove those points off of your record, you know. Although you can go to 12-hour traffic school, but I hear that they don't completely remove the point. I mean, I think it doesn't completely remove the ticket out of your record. It's only the first one that does. But anyway, but at least, however, with today you can do online traffic school rather than having to go in the building. At least, at least that's a switch. You know, that's the only good thing about it, I suppose. But other than that, it's no-brainer. I wish the laws were more mellowed out today, and the fines, and I wish they were more mellowed out right now than they are right now, and than they are. I mean, I wish they were more mellow right now. I mean, what I mean is, like, I wish they would be more mellow at right now. I mean, rather than being an ass about it, you know. And I tell you, man, but do I feel a connection between this aspect of life, of today's laws, and today's people and community aspect? Do I feel a connection there? Because it's people that are not really cool these days. I mean, they're more of an ass today. I mean, a little bit more anyway. So I want to go back to the 80s for that part. So now for the grand overall conclusion, if I was going to say which I would rather live in, which one I would rather be in right now, the 80s or right now, life, which life I would feel I would like better. I mean, I think it's kind of hard to say. I mean, if I got to choose which life to be in, I think I would probably think today. I mean, or I'm kind of neutral in some ways. I think I'm probably more neutral. But I mean, it's because it kind of evens out, because today's people are not really nice, and it's so crowded over here. So crowded, I don't like it, and the weather sucks over here. But then, you know, you got the good things. The wages are higher, are better off, and it's easier to get credit for anything, and electronics are cheap to buy, and the convenience of today is like technology. I mean, so life, comparing the two, I mean, it's like the laws are more of an ass right now, and people are not that friendly and all that stuff. But then the thing that's nice is just the electronics, and the entertainment part is fun. So it kind of weighs in together, it weighs into each other. So I mean, I would think I'm kind of neutral I'm neutral overall. But if I had to pick one, I still would have to, if I had 1 second to pick one, I probably would just stick with today, because I just like the technology of today, the convenience, the total convenience of today's technology versus, you know, like the things we can do today with technology, like emails and submitting applications online, doing everything online, and the fact that I could carry all of my music conveniently on the phone, everything. I mean, things like that. That's the part that's really cool, and that's what would actually make me want to stay here rather than the 80s. But you know, the 80s was really good for everything else, though. I mean, it's just the electronics part and the technology part, and I guess the economy, maybe, I guess, it's probably better. I mean, today, the electronics and the wages is better, because in the 80s, it was more of a challenge to get a credit card back then, but today, I mean, anybody can get credit. Everything is easier today to get everything processed, you know, when it comes to paperwork and legal things or other things like that. So I mean, there you have it. So that's my answer. That's what I would have to, how I would compare today with the 80s, how I compare the life of the 80s and today. And there you have it. All right, I hope you enjoyed all of my videos. Okay, I'll see you again, and I'm gonna still upload more videos.